Hey guys! Today I'm going to be doing my full review of Station 11, which was a 5-star read for me in the month of January. This review is going to be split into 4 distinct parts. The first being a teaser for those of you who like to go completely blind into a book. The second is going to be a spoiler-free review for people who need a little bit more before they commit. The third will be a spoiler-filled review. And the last is going to be a discussion section where I just want to talk about certain things in the book that are important to me and don't fit in the other categories. I will have the timestamps listed right here, so if you do want to just skip to certain parts, you can. Did you really wish that 2020 had been turned into an HBO miniseries where it was an apocalypse after the first month of March? Well then, this is the book for you. Station 11 is written in a style that is very reminiscent of The Road, and it is a fairly short book at only 333 pages. You bounce between different perspectives, so if you like multiple perspective books, this is a good option for you. And if you like the dystopian genre with a little bit more of a literary contemporary turn on its head, this is a great idea to read. That's it for the teaser. Very short and sweet, but if any of those things appeal to you, definitely pick this book up. Again, it was a 5-star read for me, and I don't even usually like the dystopian genre. On to my spoiler-free review. Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel is a post-apocalyptic novel that follows Kirsten, who was a little girl when the plague struck, and a band of artists who are determined to bring art and theater back to the world as it is recovering from this massive apocalyptic scenario. We also switch between the perspectives of a few people who were adults when the plague struck, and we see their lives pre- and post-pandemic. All of these characters are intertwined beautifully, and they feel so real that I honestly wondered if this is what would have happened had COVID actually wiped out the majority of the world population. It seemed so real. And if you're someone who really likes good character work, you like switching perspectives and switching timelines, you would love this book. I'm not really a fan of the dystopian genre as a whole, but something I do love about fantasy is how much attention they pay to characters, their growth, their arcs, and that is very reminiscent in this book. And as far as my enjoyment of sci-fi goes, this book talks a lot about what it means to be human and what is humanity. These are amazing topics to cover, and the fact that Station 11 does it just so beautifully made me feel things that I haven't felt from a contemporary or dystopian novel in just such a long time. If anything I have just said in the spoiler-free review or the teaser has appealed to you, please do pick up this book. Do not continue on to the spoiler-filled review until you have finished it, because I do think it's worth the read. And again, it's a very short novel, so it could be a weekend read, and it will change your life. On to my spoiler-filled review. I personally don't think Kirsten is the protagonist of this novel, even though it very much clearly sets her up as the protagonist. If anything, I think she is the weakest character that we follow throughout the novel. She grew up within the apocalypse, and so she never really remembered anything of the before times. And for that reason, I think that she ends up being a little bit less of a interesting character to look at. I also find that she's very pessimistic throughout the entire novel, which is in stark contrast to the feelings of hope that you get from the other characters, and also just the feelings of life and relatability and empathy that you can get from the other characters. Personally, my favorite perspectives are that of Miranda and Clark. Miranda is this artistic soul that I found so relatable, and she just went through so much in her life to then have it end pretty much the day after the pandemic hits the world. And yet, she lives on through her comic book series that she never intended to sell mass publicly. And that is such a beautiful story about what it means for our stories to be told and what it means for us to truly live on. And then there's Clark. Clark is the quintessential best friend who notices other people, is extremely empathetic, and finds a way to bring humanity back to the world in a way that others couldn't. Clark is basically the de facto leader of the airport group of people. and he realizes his mistakes, which he does make, but it just makes him seem so much more human, and the mistakes he does make are so relatable that I actually saw myself making the exact same mistakes as I was reading it. Obviously, all these characters are related to Arthur, who dies just before the pandemic hits Toronto. Arthur makes so many mistakes. He's arguably not a good person, and yet he brings out the best in all of the characters who are related to him. And the characters that are related to him end up thriving post-pandemic, with the exception of Miranda, who obviously dies on the beach on the day after, but that's beside the point. I find that each of the perspectives that we follow have people who are trying to bring humanity and society back to the world and life and hope in different ways that are very reflective of the lives they lived pre-pandemic and the mistakes and things that they didn't like about themselves. Miranda did not want to be in the spotlight. She kept her comics that were very good all to herself because they were for herself and not for anyone else. Yet, post-pandemic, her artwork and her comics end up being something that is worth remembering. They end up joining the museum in the airport and are a testament to the lives that people led before the pandemic hit. This just felt so fitting for Miranda. And then you have Clark, who arguably didn't pay enough attention to his friend and didn't like the kind of person that he was turning into, which was one that was worried about his image all the time and who he was being portrayed as. Clark ends up being the de facto leader of the airport group of survivors. Now he cares very much about his image, about who he is as a person, and how he is going to rebuild society. And even further than that, he learns that he's not been a very good friend and he has to be more responsive to people. He ends up becoming a pillar of stability for this group where he wasn't one for Arthur. And then there's Jeevan, one of the people we first start with. Jeevan was confused about his place in his life, and he had been his entire pre-pandemic existence. So it is only fitting that post-pandemic, he finally finds what he wants to do with his life and is perfectly content. He also sells out Miranda when she is at her weakest, and yet as soon as the pandemic strikes, he goes to his brother's side, who is very weak and disabled, and ends up trying to be there for him, almost as a penance, although I don't think that's how he sees it. It ends up just working really well thematically. Overall, the push and pull of these elements just made the story so interesting to read, and I ended up falling in love with these characters and their arcs and how they changed, and ultimately how they responded to the worst of humanity, which we obviously see through the cult and Arthur's son. On to our discussion portion, which are just some things that I want to talk about that don't really fit into full summaries. I think the music and the Shakespeare part of this book are probably the weakest points, which is interesting because I don't think it's a bad idea. The idea that people are trying to bring back art and music and theater to a post-apocalyptic world that doesn't have that anymore is super unique and sweet, and I love it, but I just felt like it wasn't really what the book was about, and it's strange because I obviously just marketed it as that for a spoiler-free review, but it was just the weakest part of the book. I feel like the more interesting part of the book is the fact that cults took over and that we have created this whole religion around why people died and why people survived. And it's so interesting, and it's something I could conceivably see happening if we did wipe out a majority of the population. People like justifications for things. That's why we have legends. That's why we have myths. So the fact that a religion would be based off of such a cataclysmic event is completely realistic and super interesting. And then there's a museum of pre-pandemic times in the airport. I find that this is the heart of humanity. This is what the post-pandemic world needed, is reminders of the weird things that are so mundane to us, but mystifying to people who have never seen them before. Things like a driver's license and a credit card that are put on display, or Miranda's comic books. These are things that really describe who we are that we don't even think about. And it made me think about the things that are in my life that I completely take for granted and would be mystifying if society completely collapsed. For example, right now I'm sitting next to a fake plant. I don't think that the post-pandemic world would see much need for these, and the fact that they do exist is kind of crazy when you think about it. Thanks, I do. Anyway, if you guys have anything else you want to discuss about Station 11, I love talking about it, so just leave a comment and I will try and respond to as many as I can. Anyway, thank you guys for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.